Hi everyone. We're going to talk about the problem of split incentives in this video. Split incentives are a problem that can prevent buildings from being as efficient as they should be. And by solving the problem of split incentives, we can pressure buildings to have more energy efficiency, to use less power, and this can help global warming. To start off with a definition of split incentives, this occurs basically when we have different goals whenever we're trying to sell a building or we're creating a rental agreement. So in both of these things, we have a contract between two people or two sides, and basically the split incentives mean that they both have different goals. These different goals basically mean that we're not necessarily always putting energy center as the most important goal. So by trying to solve the split incentive problems, we try to force both sides to have a common interest in reducing the energy use of a building or to increase its efficiency. One common way that split incentives show up is when builders are building new homes. Their primary goal is to essentially make the most money from whatever house they've built. However, a home buyer not only wants to get the house for the best price possible, but they're also going to want to think about the ongoing costs of energy. So they're going to want to think about how high their water bills are, their electricity bills, and their gas bills. And the home builder may not necessarily have an interest in making the house as efficient as possible. As long as they can sell it, they're willing to cut corners on things like energy efficiency. And many people, when they buy homes, may look at that low price and think that everything's okay, but then they realize that they have to spend a lot of money on heating and cooling because it's not well insulated or it's got some other kind of problems with heating. So one way to think about this is that for the home buyer, it's a little bit like the problem you might have if you buy a printer. A computer printer can be very cheap, but then you realize that you're dependent on the ink cartridges or the toner cartridges, and they're very expensive. In the same way, if you buy a home, the price might be low, but if it's really expensive and its energy costs are really high, you may lose all of the savings for the low buying price. So what we need to do is to try to figure out a way to have the home builder also have an interest in low energy costs. And this is going to benefit both the home builder and the home buyer, but lower energy costs is going to mean more efficiency, and that's going to help everybody by reducing global warming as well. So one of the things that building codes can do is they enforce certain kinds of energy efficiency standards. Over time, building codes have done things like expected more insulation, tighter buildings with less infiltration, and other things that reduce their heating and cooling costs. So what this means is that the home builder now has to comply with those energy rules, and they're now, basically by following those rules, reducing the energy costs for the home buyer. And again, there's also that benefit to everybody else because the home that uses less energy is contributing less to global warming as well. So what the building codes do in this case is they create shared incentives. Now both sides basically have an interest in reducing the energy costs of the home. It is important, though, to make this work that we also need building codes to have enforcement. So it's not enough to just write the rules, but we'd also need to make sure that there's inspections being done to make sure that the energy standards are being met. And if a home builder isn't complying, they're not following the rules, we need things like punishments. So we would need things like fines or perhaps forcing the home builders to fix up their houses if they're not complying with these minimum standards. So over time, we can force these interests to get even better as well. So if we improve the building codes, then this continues to be a win-win situation for both sides because they do have that shared interest in reducing energy costs. And again, one of the primary purposes isn't just to benefit the home buyer, but also the larger society with less energy use and fewer emissions that are being created as a result. The split incentive problem also shows up when we have rental agreements between landlords and the people that they rent to. In most cases, landlords force their renters to pay all the utilities. So if you rent, you're responsible for your heating and cooling, your electricity, your water, and the like. One of the problems is, though, is that landlords do not necessarily have an incentive to make their appliances efficient, to make their insulation better, to make sure that their buildings are using less energy. If they can force their renters to pay, then they will. The problem for the renter, however, is that even if they want to make improvements in their apartment or the house that they're renting, because it's owned by the landlord, they're not necessarily going to do it. They may not be allowed to. Renters also often are only in their apartments or homes for a short period of time. So if you only live in an apartment for a year, it's going to be way too expensive for you to put in new windows or to add insulation anyway. And somebody else is going to get the benefit from it. Because it's too expensive, you're likely going to pay the higher energy costs for that short period and leave it to somebody else. Except there's no incentive to deal with the problem in this case. So if the landlord's forcing the renter to pay for all of the energy use, then again, there's no shared interest here. Landlords don't really care about this very much in this situation because they simply force somebody else, the renter, to pay for it. So one way to solve this problem is to force landlords to have to comply with certain kinds of energy standards. We don't typically apply the building code to buildings that are already created, but we could essentially enforce certain kinds of energy standards on these buildings. So again, we could force a landlord to have to make renovations to basically make it more efficient. So add insulation, put in better windows, put in better appliances that use less energy, and the like. So what ends up happening in this case is, once again, we see that the landlord is basically being forced to reduce the energy that the renter will use, and that this is going to benefit the renter because they're going to be paying lower costs. Now, because landlords often do not want to do this voluntarily, another thing that we could also do is we could have government programs, for instance, for low interest loans to allow landlords to make these improvements. Or we could essentially have some other kind of program to basically improve energy standards. So we could also have programs that make this easier for those landlords to pay if we wish. But the idea is that by improving energy standards that apply to existing buildings, then landlords are going to have to design for lower energy use, and this is also going to benefit renters. And as with the housing example, when we use less energy, this is going to benefit all of us as well. The final example of when we have a split incentive is when somebody is selling an existing home and a home buyer wants to buy it. So the home seller has an interest that's very similar to a builder. They want to get the highest price they can get for their house, and the home buyer wants to pay the lowest or the best price. But one of the things that a home buyer may not consider is how much those energy costs are. And in a lot of places, there isn't actually mandatory laws that say you have to show the potential home buyer your past electricity bills or your past gas bills. So one of the things that we can do, and some places have done this, is to pass what are called utility disclosure laws. And this basically means that before someone can buy your house, you have to show them your past bills. So they'd have to see your past water bills, your past electricity bills, your past gas bills, so they can see, given the insulation, the appliances that you have in your home, just how efficient it really is. So again, this basically gives the home buyer more information, and they may decide if the house uses a lot of electricity, maybe it's not very well insulated and air conditioning costs are just too high. And they may decide, I'm not going to buy that house, or they may expect a lower price so that they can do those investments themselves. Another thing that might happen is that if a home seller is forced to show that their home is not very energy efficient, they may make those improvements themselves. So again, if they're using a lot of electricity to heat and cool their home, then they may insulate better rather than show a person the really high bills, and that way they can get a higher price for their home, but it also improves the energy use for the future owner as well. So again, this is potentially by showing the utility bills, forcing both the seller and the buyer to have an interest for low energy costs. And of course, once again, once we do this, it's benefiting everyone in the larger society and the larger world with lower energy use and fewer emissions as a result. So to summarize the main messages that we've talked about in this video, split incentives mean that two sides basically lack a shared goal. This might be a landlord and a renter. This might be a home builder and a home buyer. This might be someone who owns an existing home and somebody who wants to buy it. Now the idea is that when they don't have that shared interest, this can be bad from the point of view of global warming because it might mean that the home or the apartment is using a lot of energy. And again, there may not be an incentive for the current landlord or the current owner to make energy efficiency improvements. But when we basically force landlords or home builders or homeowners to make those changes with things like building code improvements or utility disclosure, then we're basically benefiting the person who wants to rent, the person who might buy the home, and the larger society and the larger world. And the larger world is benefiting because when we do this, we're making energy use more efficient, we're using less, and that's going to mean fewer emissions. So I'd like to point out that there is a little bit about split incentives in your reading The Big Fix, but this video has more detail. So look in both places and hopefully you'll understand the concept a little bit better after you've read this week's chapter reading as well. Thank you for listening, everyone, and until next time, when I'll see you then.